It cannot be supposed, for instance, that male birds of paradise or peacocks should take such pains in erecting, spreading, and vibrating their beautiful plumes before the females for no purpose. Charles Darwin. Darwin is referring to sexual selection, which is selection that increases an individual's chance of getting a mate. The currency of selection is not really survival, but successful reproduction, which would explain why so many species have traits that give them a disadvantage in survival but an advantage in reproduction. The peacock is a very intriguing animal when it is in full display, portraying his blue-green tail studded with eye spots. Advantage of the male peacock tail is that it allows them to attract mates much more efficiently. The bright colors and movements of the peacock's tail attracts female peahens. Unfortunately, there are many disadvantages, such as the long tail causes problems with flight, the bright colors attract predators, and it costs a lot of energy to regrow every year. The peacock's tail has a disadvantage in survival, but in terms of sexual reproduction, it improves the male's chances of mating. The colored lizard. Males have a turquoise body with yellow head, black neck collars, and black and white spots. The females are grayish brown and only lightly spotted. An experiment was conducted to test hypothesis that males' bright color attracts more predators. To test hypothesis, clay models were painted to look like males and females and were put out in the desert. Bite marks on the clay models was then recorded a week later. The results showed that out of the male clay models, 35 out of 40 showed bite marks. On the females, none were attacked. The advantage of the male colored lizard is its ability to attract mates, but the disadvantage, proven by the experiment conducted, is its survival and attraction to predators. Sexual dimorphisms, derived from the Greek word for two forms, are traits that differ between male and females of a species, such as tails and color. Biologists believe that sexually dimorphic traits in males seem to violate evolutionary theory due to the amount of time and energy it takes to display them, and they also reduce survival. Some examples of sexual dimorphism include the male swordfish, which have a sword at the end of their tail in order to defend their territory from other males. The females, however, do not contain the sword at the end of their tail, making them both sexually dimorphic. Another example is the male birds of paradise, which are brightly colored with head ornaments that are sky blue on one side and brown on the other. Female birds are unattractive and dull colored, making them both sexually dimorphic. Forms of sexual selection. Sexual selection comes in two forms. 1. Direct competition between males for access to females. Examples of direct competition include clashing antlers of deer, stabbing horns of the stag beetle, head butting of stalk-eyed flies, or bloody battles of massive elephant seals. The male that wins the battle wins access to females by driving off competitors. Selection will favor any trait that promotes such victories so long as the increased chance of getting mates more than offsets any reduced survival. Female choosiness among possible mates. Examples: bright colors, ornaments, bowers, and mating displays are all used to attract the female attention. Females find some male traits and behaviors more attractive than others, so genes that produce those features accumulate in populations. There is also a sense of competition that exists in this form of sexual selection, but it is indirect. The males that have the loudest voices, brightest colors, most alluring pheromones, sexiest displays are the winning males. In these scenarios, the winner is decided by the females. How did all these costly traits of the males evolve? These traits evolved because the currency of selection is not really survival, but it's successful sexual reproduction. Males' elaborate behaviors, seductive mating calls, bright colors, fancy ornaments do not help with its survival, but increase the chance of the male to find a possible mate and have offsprings. Darwin was the first to understand and recognize the trade-off and named it sexual selection. Sexual selection is a process that increases an individual's chance of finding a mate. Although similar to natural selection, it's unique because it produces Adaptive adaptations.
Marion Petrie and Tim Holliday wanted to test sexual selection, so they decided to cut off 20 eye spots off one group of male peacocks, of course, and compare this. So this would be the experimental group, and compare it to a control group that had males with no cuts. And on average, the males of the cut tails had 2.5 fewer mates in comparison to the control males. This was a case of taking out equality and observing the results of its loss. Malt Anderson actually did the opposite. So what he did is he added a trait to the group of African long-tailed widowbirds. And what he did is he actually created three different groups. In the first group, he cut off the tail of the widowbird, and then and didn't glue it on. In the second group, he cut off the tail and then glued it back on to see what are the effects of the glue. And in the third experiment, he took the tails from the first group and attached it with the glue to the second. And he noticed that the birds with the longest tail, the ones that were glued back on, had the most mating. This was one of many experiments that he had done to study sexual selection. And like him, many people began to see that there were trends in sexual selection. Male qualities were tempted to woo females of its species. For example, birds fighting for territory. Having more territory meant more appealing to females. And then in other species, some animals, including the spiders and fishes, they prefer larger males. So these are some incentives for females to choose them. But there are two underlying questions we must consider. Why do females get to do the choosing, while males must woo or fight for them? And more importantly, why do females get to choose at all? Questions like these get us to think about why sex exists in the first place. And if you think about the question, it's pretty interesting, because we see that in nature, genes actually spread quicker through other methods, like parthenogenesis, by producing eggs that develop without fertilization. We also see that by having sex, you're producing offspring that are only 50% of your own genes and are not completely made of the 100% the same as you or the parent. Yet we still see it in nature, so there must be, of course, a benefit to having it. So there's, of course, a long list of theories to go with why sex exists, and the most profound theory is sex creates diversity. During genetic recombination, this is the most profound topic to our understanding. And there are other questions that add to why sex exists. Why are there only two sexes? Why not more? Why is sperm and egg size different? Interesting enough, what happens because of sexual selection is there are more males being produced that are more attractive or vigorous and are able to mate more often with females of its species. And on the other hand, females are produced which are more picky and looking for specific character traits in their mates. These are the types of animals that are being produced by this mechanism. But this is not just what each gender consists of. In fact, there are two more forms of which physical traits are expressed. For the genders, of course, there's the one form in which both the sexes look exactly the same. In this case, there wouldn't be sexual selection. And then the last form, where the male has to actually give birth to the offspring, and the females must compete for the males. So this is when the dysmorphy switches, and the gender roles switch.
Alfred Russel Wallace believed that females were less colorful than males because it helped them be camouflaged from predators, while the bright colors and ornaments of males were byproducts of their physiology. Charles Darwin felt strongly that male calls, colors, and ornaments evolved as a result of female choice. He saw no reason why females should choose things like elaborate songs or long tails unless they found them intrinsically appealing. Results. It turns out Darwin's theory was more accurate than Wallace's, but he was not completely correct on this matter. He was correct about the existence of female choosiness, which explains sexual dimorphisms. However, it does not make sense that female preference is based solely on aesthetics. We now know that female preferences are themselves adaptive, because preferring certain types of males helps females spread their genes. Preferences aren't always a matter of random inborn taste, as Darwin supposed, but in many cases probably evolved by selection. What does a female have to gain by choosing a particular male? One reason is that she can benefit directly, which is by choosing a male who will help her produce more or healthier young during the act of childcare. Another reason is that she can benefit indirectly by choosing a male who has better genes than those of other males, which will eventually be passed down to her offsprings to benefit them also.
So, to finish off the presentation, there are some key points that have to be hit home on the topic of sexual selection. For one, the whole process of directional selection of growing more and more traits that members of the female group get to pick from the males, the male group, stops only when the male trait becomes so exaggerated that any further increase reduces the male's survival more than it attracts females or even its ability to sufficiently create more offspring. At this point, one can say the feature balances out. This may explain why the tail of the African long-tailed widow bird is not growing longer and longer each generation. Further growth of this feature may inhibit its ability to efficiently fly to different locations to mate, or even act as a burden on its body since the tail must be constantly maintained. Second, there are three types of genes that increase in frequency together because of sexual selection. We can see these with the great tree frog found in the southern United States, as a test was done to see the benefits of mating some frogs with long collars and some with short collars. So the gene for the male indicator traits reflects that he has good genes. Giving a long and loud call is the indicator gene that females look for. Second, the gene that makes a female prefer that indicator trait, that's also important, comes from the female genes, of course. The third, the good genes whose presence is reflected by the indicator. Offspring from long collars actually grow faster and survive better as tadpoles, are larger at metamorphosis, and grow faster after metamorphosis, and this is done in comparison. This comparison is of course made with offspring of short collars, and of course this was all tested in the lab, and it shows the good genes are reflected. And lastly, we come back to the peacock example, where we're trying to find out why females prefer more eye spots. Whether they know it or not, this is beneficial to their offspring in the end, with a better edge in survival and reproduction, because peacocks with more spots, eye spots, are healthier. And that is how sexual selection drives evolution.